Welcome into episode 214 of the Skate Podcast. I'm Brian D. Felice, joined by Bridgette and Scott McLaughlin. Bridgette and Scott, it is August 8th. We're about 5.5 weeks away from preseason hockey. So it's really, hopefully the NFL can kind of distract us in the meantime. And before we know it, preseason will be here and hockey season will be here. In the meantime, media had a chance to speak with Jeremy Swayman earlier today. And if there was anywhere you guys wanted to jump off from that interview, and first of all, I mean, obviously, how are you guys? It's been a little bit since we spoke.
Yeah, I'm good. Just getting through the summer. Got Jimmy Fund Radio Telethon coming up in a couple weeks. Been doing some planning for that. Got my sister's wedding next month. Been planning for that.
Oh wow!
I'm officiating it, which is going to be that's like a once in a lifetime experience. So we'll see how that goes. Just hoping I don't screw it up.
Well, at least you won't be upstaged by Brad Marchand and Patrice Bergeron kissing.
That's true. As far as I know, they're not invited, so don't have to worry about them.
You might want to invite them. Honestly, they seem like a good time.
Yeah, So for those who, I think most people probably get the reference, but Charlie McAvoy got married this past weekend, and the most viral video to come out of it was Marchand and Bergeron dancing together, and Marchand sneaking a kiss in during it. So it certainly seemed like they were having a good time. That was actually one of the things Swayman talked about when we talked to him today. Said they didn't miss a beat, amazed by their chemistry. But he also said like that being at that wedding, it was kind of a reminder of what they built last year, and almost kind of sad because there's people who are there that aren't going to be on the team this coming season, obviously led by Bergeron, but others who were there and are no longer on the roster. So
yeah, Taylor Hall and Nick Foligno were both there. Clifton was there. They even had, I believe, Krug was there, and Tuukka. So some people that have retired, some people that were traded this offseason or previously. And yeah, it was sad because I feel like he's such an optimistic person, Swayman, and he would start like most of his answers were kind of starting sad, and then he had to add something happy at the end of it. So even with the contract stuff, he wasn't happy with how the arbitration, he didn't want to go to arbitration. He said he was pretty candid about that part. And then he was like, but I learned this or that along the way. And then when it came to the wedding, it was also a bittersweet situation, I think. And even when he was talking about his training that he's been doing in the offseason, he said it's all driven by not wanting to have that Game 7 feeling. And it's still very real and fresh for a lot of these guys that they're having these really happy moments, but they're kind of still thinking what could have been if we just did things right last year.
Yeah, like you mentioned, he said he learned a lot from the arbitration process, and thanked his agents and the NHLPA lawyers, obviously the people who helped him kind of fight his case and make his argument. And he also said that he never wants to go through it again, and he wouldn't want any of his teammates or friends to go through it. And he said he didn't take it personally, and he doesn't. He's still happy to be a Bruin, and he isn't worried about that relationship going forward. He prefaced it all with that. So, but yeah, this is kind of what we talked about before when we talked about, no one wants to go to arbitration because it is uncomfortable. You go into a hearing and the team has to sit there and argue why you're not worth the money you think you're worth. And you have to sit there and listen to it. And it's no one likes that. The team doesn't like doing that because they know it's not going to be well received, and players don't like hearing that. A lot of players, that's why they just leave negotiations to their agents, and they don't actually want to be in the room because they don't want to hear what the team's saying for why they don't deserve that money or whatever. And usually in a regular negotiation, the agent can serve as that buffer where okay, they're going to hear something from the team, but then they're not going to report every single word back to the player because they don't want them getting caught up in all of it. But when you go to arbitration, there's really no choice. You're there and you're going to hear it.
And I think he hated the uncertainty of it. because he kept saying like he was hearing different things and he didn't know what was true and what was right. And then he also kept saying the phrase "is just going day by day," which kind of made me think he didn't necessarily know if they were going to come to an agreement in the first place. So like, because they were pretty far apart in their numbers. The Bruins offered $2 million and he was asking for 4.8. So those are, you know, especially with the cap situation the Bruins have, that was a pretty big difference for them to be starting at. And they end up getting right around 3.5 for Swayman. But I think the uncertainty bothered him because he likes all of his teammates, like we just stated, and he didn't want to think about not being a Bruin. So he said he's happy. But we talked about this last episode too. It's only a 1-year deal. And because it's only a 1-year deal, he's still a restricted free agent. So there's a chance if they don't extend him during the season, he could end up in arbitration again, which he said he absolutely doesn't want to do. And from that, I get that if that happens again, then, you know, that might actually burn the bridge, and that would be really bad for the relationship with the Bruins if they were to do that. So kind of makes me feel like there must be some sort of agreement maybe between him and Sweeney that they'd want to get a new contract before the end of the season, before restricted free agency hits again.
Yeah, and unless something severely goes wrong for Swayman this year, I think that the Bruins will probably they'll choose him over Ullmark long term. I would imagine. I just feel like if push came to shove and you had to stick with one guy going forward, if all things considered equal, if both guys have another really strong year, it just comes down to affordability and youth. And I mean, obviously Swayman would get an increase in pay, but I just, you know, I think it's an interesting situation that they found themselves in, because what's going against Swayman in the arbitration hearing is just from an intangible perspective is like it's tough to demand 4.8 million or hope for that when there's a Vezina Trophy winning goalie on the roster and he's not you. But at the same time, what's going for Swayman is his statistics are excellent, and also going into this coming season, the Bruins are going to need their goaltending to be maybe not as strong as it was last year, because that's just such a high bar to achieve again. But I think we all kind of agree that the Bruins might have trouble scoring this year compared to, well, especially compared to last year, but just in general. And they're going to have to rely on goaltending and defense more so this year than I think in the following years when they'll have more cap space to potentially go out and build a more offensive roster than they do right now. But yeah, both parties landed where they landed. And honestly, I think it's probably right around where it should be.
Yeah, and Scott, you actually asked the question to Swayman about the goalie duo, right? I heard your voice in there.
Yeah.
Get in there to ask about the situation with Ullmark.
Yeah, I asked him, you know, like, how do you, because he was asked one question about it and he was like, yeah, like nothing's going to split us up. And then I followed up and asked basically, like, how do you balance sort of that friendship and great relationship you guys obviously have with also like a personal desire to want to be a number one goalie, want more playing time, whatever it might be. And he basically said like him and Ullmark, the fact that they both have that desire is like what allows it to work, because they do just keep constantly pushing each other. And they know that if either one of them slips up or gets comfortable or starts struggling, the other one's going to run with the job and start playing more games. And like, we even saw that in practice last year. Like things actually played out that way early in the season, where for a little Swayman got off to a little bit of a slower start, and Ullmark would get, you know, 2 games in a row or 3 out of 4 or whatever. And then Swayman obviously had an injury situation too, and that factored in. But yeah, when Swayman got back and got up to speed, it became more of a true rotation because they were both pushing each other, and they were both at such a high level that you didn't have to worry about, oh, should we ride the hot hand? It's like, well, they're both the hot hand, so it doesn't really matter.
Except for in the playoffs.
Yeah. Which, you know, I'm going to be curious, like whenever we get to talk to Montgomery, you know, which might not be until like training camp.
Well, he might actually be doing Jimmy Fun stuff. I know
he might. He did last year.
Yeah, I remember I was writing something about what he said at the Jimmy Fund, because obviously it's about raising money, but during the conversation, real questions get asked. And I remember he was talking about lifestyle last year. So, I mean, he does answer real questions that our hosts have. So,
yeah. So I'll be curious though, like if there's any sort of organizational shift in terms of being more open to a rotation in the playoffs. Because like I know last year, every time Montgomery was asked, he said like, "Yeah, we're open to it, but I don't think we're going to do it." And then sure enough, they didn't. And whether they would have in the second, third round going forward, we'll never know because they didn't get there. But I am curious, like if there's any sort of shift where they might be more open to it, kind of from the start this year. Because it's one of those things. Like I've talked to a few people, just around the hockey world in general, and it's like. And I think even Bruce Cassidy said it when he was on with Gresham Fourier. Or no, he was on the Greg Hill show when he brought the cup back to Massachusetts and said something along the lines of like, at some point, someone is going to have a true goalie rotation in the playoffs. And it's like everyone's sort of just waiting to see who the first one who is going to be, who tries it and succeeds and wins. But it's like that. I feel like that attitude is really prevalent where like a bunch of people will say, yeah, it's going to happen at some point, but then no one really seems to want to be the first one to really try it. So, I thought last year it could have and should have been the Bruins. I made that case on here on Sunday Skate that I thought they should have just stuck with the rotation.
mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm curious like if there's going to be any sort of shift in philosophy and like more openness to it.
Yeah, I mean, it could have saved the series. It's what like we mentioned, like when you lose in Game 7, obviously there's so many moments you can look back on, and there were a lot of coaching mistakes, and that was probably one of them. You don't want to. I know Swim played for 2 minutes in one of the other games, but essentially he was going in Game 7 after not playing, a lot of time before that. So he was put in a tough situation, and especially with his answer to you today, Scott, where he was saying like they pushed each other and they'd be mad at each other if they both weren't trying to steal the job. Like that's just kind of how their relationship works and they understand. I feel like when you go at it like that the whole season, and then you go away from it, that's going to change your psychology because you're expecting that reward for, maybe doing the right things or it's your time to get in there and then you don't, then you change up something you did the whole season. It kind of throws things off. And a lot of the issues that came in the playoffs kind of seemed like mental mistakes that maybe were set off by decisions that coaches made.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still not convinced that it was a lack of strategic goalie splitting in the playoffs that did the Bruins in. I feel like
I think Ullmark was potentially dealing with an injury and wasn't we don't know what percent he was at. So that adds into the fact that Swayman may have been your better option, but you're too afraid to go to the rotation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would have gone to Swayman earlier than they did. All I'm saying is that I feel like Scott, you kind of alluded to the fact that you recommended they go with the more traditional split that they did in the regular season. And I still think that would have presented its own challenges if they were dead set on just splitting without really considering if somebody's hot or somebody's not feeling it. I feel like if it was every other game, that brings challenges. What I thought they should have done is, and this is what I recommended too, and it was kind of similar to what you were saying, but you go with the guy who's playing the best, and if he falters, you don't give him too much time to you just have to go to the other guy. I mean, Ullmark played well up until Game 5 in that series, and he had that awful turnover in Game 5, and I think that's sometimes it's an unforgivable mistake, and it shows signs of mental fatigue or physical fatigue or whatever. But I would have gone to Swayman in Game 6. So yeah, I think they went to him too late, but it can't just be, in my opinion. I mean, look at Vegas. Vegas went through 5 goalies, but it wasn't a goalie split. It was based on necessity and who was playing well and whatnot. So I just think you have to have a feel for it. If you think a guy is struggling, he's not going to be the best chance to win, go with the other guy. But it shouldn't be this guy's going to play no matter what every game, and it shouldn't be we're going to split these guys no matter what. Like, I think you just need to have a feel for it. And I just feel like the Bruins failed having a feel for that tandem going into game 6 against Florida. And this is not to just rehash last spring, but while we're on this topic of it, I just feel like it's not a black and white answer.
Yeah. But like also, if Ullmark was a little bit banged up, it could have been nice to get him rest. You know, like they could have rotated in order to get rest, which obviously in the playoffs becomes more complicated with the rest versus riding someone. And also like the workload during the regular season was less for him than it was in the playoffs. So adding an extra workload could mess with, you know, health or recovery and things like that. So there was a lot that goes into it. And I wonder what they'll do this season, assuming they make the playoffs. And we're getting way ahead of ourselves now. But in terms of talking about that goalie rotation, I'm sure we're going to be seeing more goalie hugs this year, because he sounded like that's his Swayman's favorite part of winning is the goalie hug. So
yeah, I think Brian said on the last podcast, we might not be seeing 65 of them though. But yeah, I mean, it's bringing it full circle though back to Swayman and his contract, like how the rotation, you know, works out this year is obviously going to have a huge effect on what Swayman's next contract looks like, because he ends up with only a 1-year deal this time around. And yeah, Bridgette, you mentioned like he could be a restricted free agent again, so he still doesn't have, you know, a ton of leverage in terms of, obviously he can't go to the open market. But you know, if it's a true split, then they're sort of in the same situation where it's like, I'm sure Swayman is going to want to make the case that he can be a number one, and the Bruins can kind of counter and be like, well, but you haven't actually really had to do that yet. You've just split time. And from the Bruins perspective, it's like if Swayman's due for another raise next year, then yeah, like it does kind of force your hand even more to potentially move one of them. And we assume Ullmark would be the one who's more likely to get traded because he is older. And it's like, you know, I think Swayman can be a number one. Like I feel like he's really good in all the underlying metrics and regular metrics. They're all there. But if you're the Bruins, it's like there could, in theory, like be a question about workload if he's still only splitting time, or how does he handle being a starter in the playoffs when he, you know, so far his playoff experience has been coming in, you know, almost in like emergency situations and replacing Ullmark after struggles, whether that was last year, you know, 2022 already being down 2-0, or this past year where it's, you know, the series is slipping away and he gets thrown in game 7, and it's like he still hasn't actually started a series. So that's also still kind of like an experience that he hasn't had, that I would think the Bruins would want to see before, you know, they really go all in on like if we're talking like a long-term contract and committing to him as the number one going forward, and, you know, moving on from Ullmark.
And he mentioned when asked about Bergeron, because obviously, you know, we haven't heard what he was going to say about that yet. So he was asked about Bergeron and like, you know, the next group of leaders, and he put himself in the category, and he said we're going to be in the organization for a long time, and we're going to try to keep his legacy going. But like that kind of to me showed me he wants to get a long-term deal done, because he was considering himself in that crew. He called, you know, like the young core that's coming up, and he said we. So I think he really wants to stay here. He's mentioned before how he likes it here. Obviously that's what most people say, but I think he genuinely means that, and wants to be part of, you know, the group of McAvoy and, you know, even Pasternak, even though he's a little bit older, and all the other guys that they've kind of recently locked up for a long time. He wants to be part of that.
So this reminds me of a question I wanted to ask you guys, and we've talked a lot about, you know, the Bruins going into next year, and I just feel like Swayman and the defense are a good place to talk about right now, because we've talked a lot about the forwards, and on NHL.com, and now that we're getting closer to training camp and all these things, you start to see them the NHL doing their 32 teams and 30-day previews, and you're starting to see people start to illustrate what these rosters are going to look like and what to expect from them. And I actually haven't heard one quote unquote NHL analyst or expert predict the Bruins to miss the playoffs this year. And I'm sure that there are people out there, but if you were to watch TSN or Sportsnet or anybody on NHL, like anybody whose job it is to analyze the league, everybody's got the Bruins as like, yeah, they're not going to be as good as last year, but guess what? That's an impossible bar to set them to because nobody in NHL history had the season they had last year. So if you look at the Bruins compared to the landscape of the NHL, how do they stack up? And a lot of people still have the Bruins expected to make the playoffs. It's not going to be an easy journey, but the Bruins defense and goaltending is, yes, Bridget?
Do you remember last year when people picked them not to make the playoffs?
Yes.
In particular, some New York writers that picked them to not even make the playoffs.
Yeah, that was clearly. I mean, we laughed at that at the time, to be honest with you.
Yeah, we did. Yeah,
and the roster that they had in the springtime was a lot different than the roster they had to start the season with. But yeah, people, to your point, people thought the Bruins were going to miss the playoffs. Why? Because Marchand and McAvoy were expected to miss the first half of the season, and that would be too much for the Bruins to overcome. That they were getting older, blah blah blah. And you know what? By all accounts, the Bruins just flipped the entire script on their head. Those players came back earlier than anticipated. The players who struggled the year before bounced back. Age was not a problem. But in any event, the Bruins defense and goaltending is still far better than a lot of the teams who have better offense than Boston going into this year, at least on paper. And it just reminds you of the value of goaltending and defense, and that the Bruins just need to find ways to score just enough. But anyway, I just wanted to bring this up to you guys because it's interesting. It seems so doom and gloom for us, and we've talked about the Bruins are still good, but just how important is it that the Bruins defense and goaltending, it really is head and shoulders above, I would say, 95% of the league this year.
Yeah, and part of people predicting them to still make the playoffs is like how much of a buffer there is for them to lose and slide back and still make it. Last year, they could have been 43 points worse and they would have made the playoffs. Like you could have just flipped 21 of their wins, a third of their wins to losses, and they still would have made the playoffs. Like it's actually insane.
That like doesn't even, I didn't even look at it. Like I didn't check into that, but that's insane.
Yeah. So, I think we all expect a pretty big, like, even if they ran the same team back, I'd be like, there's going to be a step back because you don't win 65 games. Like, that's just not going to happen again. So add in everything they lost, and it's like, yeah, it's going to be a fairly significant step back in terms of wins, losses, and points. But they can afford a pretty big one and still be in the top 8. And I think they should be, and you're right. It's the defense and goaltending that's at the top of the list. Generally, every year, if you look at the teams that give up the fewest goals, for the most part, they're playoff teams. Like, very rarely is there a non-playoff team that ranks in like the top 3 to 5 in goals against. So the Bruins led the league last year by a comfortable margin in goals against. Now, obviously, those losses affect them there as well, right? Like, they're not going to have as much possession. They're not going to be pinning teams back as much. But the anchor of that, Ullmark, Swayman, a really good decor that is pretty much back. You subtract Orlov, but he wasn't there until late in the season. You subtract Clifton, but Shattenkirk's a perfectly fine replacement and possibly even a better fit next to Forbert because of his puck moving. So, like, that should still be there. Yeah, losing Bergeron's huge. We know the impact he makes defensively. But they still have defensively responsible forwards. So they should be able to do a good job preventing teams from scoring. And maybe it's not quite to the level of last year. Maybe Ullmark isn't winning the Triple Crown again. But it should still be at a fairly high level. And if they're a top 5 to 7 defense in the NHL, there's a really good chance they're going to be a playoff team. And even if they're fairly low scoring. Like you win low scoring games and you get in that way. So, and like they're not going to be one of the lowest scoring teams because they have David Pastrnak. So, assuming he stays healthy, if Brad Marchand, looks a little more like Brad Marchand of the past and not Brad Marchand recovering from double hip surgery, then your offense isn't going to be one of the worst in the league. It's going to be, I don't know, middle of the pack, maybe even better than that. So that's a recipe for a playoff team. And then obviously from there we can go into like whether they're actually a contender or whatever, but there's a whole season to play out between now and then to, see where they're at come playoffs.
In terms of you mentioned the fewest goals against, they were the only team with fewer than 200 goals against in the whole league. I mean, some teams gave up over 300. They gave up 177, which was the best by quite a bit. And they were plus 128 goal differential, which is crazy and obviously not going to happen again. But it's kind of funny because we just were going through the whole season kind of just on the ride. And I still can't believe they only had 12 losses like that. Like 65 wins, like you think about, oh, that's a lot of wins. But like when you just look in the loss column and there's only 12, like it's like, how did they even manage to only lose 12 games in regulation? I don't know how. I don't know.
And it's insane. That's why it never happened before, and it may not happen again. And honestly, if it does, I wouldn't be surprised if the team that accomplishes that feat won't have the same struggles that the Bruins had in the playoffs. I mean, I don't know. I want to sit here and say like the NHL is just it's sometimes everything falls your way, and everything didn't fall the Bruins' way last year necessarily. I mean, we just talked about it. Like you started the year without two major players. You had injuries along the way. I mean, you were without Jake DeBrusk, who's a top 6 player, top line winger for them last year for a couple of months. Like they had their injuries. I mean, so they had their hurdles, but it just on the scoreboard, just everything went their way. And sometimes it's just like can you just catch a team on an off night? Can you catch a team on a third game of a 4-game road trip? Can you catch it? Can that happen all year long? No. And the parity's too great in the NHL for that to be a reality. To just win 65 out of 82 games is really insane. But as we see, that can come with its challenges afterwards, because you really should face a lot of adversity, or at least more than the Bruins did last year on the scoreboard. And I think they'll probably get that this year. So they may be a better team off for it. And they're a much different team. Like we talked about it before, when they collapsed in 2010 and came back and won a cup a year later, like you had a lot of the same players on that team. This really is like, it's not only did you experience the loss of last year, but you don't really have much roster carryover to feel it throughout the lineup. It's not like they can galvanize behind that. Like, guys, we need to come back this year and redeem ourselves. Because truthfully, I mean, I would say 45% of the rosters changed over from last year.
Yeah, I still think that there's a significant chunk though that can, start with the goalies again. Most of the D core, and then your Pastrnak, Marchand, Coyle, Frederick, DeBrusk, Zacha. Like, there's still enough guys there that I think can draw on that. Enough guys who are in key roles and important positions and going to be playing a lot of minutes for you. So you're right. It's almost certainly more turnover than 2010 to 2011, but I still think there's enough there that, if these guys take the right approach and take, like what Swayman laid out today of wanting to do everything possible to avoid that, having that feeling again, they should have enough guys who can kind of rally around that. And some of the guys coming in, I think, are going to be motivated too. Like, Shattenkirk's won a cup before, and he talked about how, he went out to Anaheim, didn't even have a chance, was on a rebuilding team, and like he wants that feeling again. James Van Riemsdyk's never won a cup. I'm sure he would like to. So, Lucic, we know how much Lucic wants that, wanted to be back here, wants to kind of relive those glory days and have that feeling again. So I think they will be able to use it as motivation, but that motivation, I don't think can like fully outweigh talent. So it still comes back to like, is there going to be enough talent left here for them to, really be able to have a team that can make a run? Because we've talked about that, right? Like highlighting the teams that had record seasons and blew it in the playoffs and then won the next year, whether it was the Lightning from 2019 to 2020 or the Red Wings from 96 to 97. But I think if you went through those rosters, I think to Brian's point, you'd also find probably a lot more consistency and not so many top players departing in between.
Yeah, but as part of this conversation, when we were talking about how last season when the Bruins started out, they weren't, they had a lot of guys that weren't available to play in the first month. But this year, correct me if I'm wrong, everybody's pretty healthy going into the season. I know we talked about Lindholm potentially having something going on with his foot, but as far as we know, it's not going to affect his starting time. So, I mean, I feel like the team is heading into this season in a better situation health-wise than they were last year. Not personnel-wise, obviously, for all the things we've talked about, but health-wise, everybody seems to be doing okay.
Yeah, I mean, the Bruins haven't announced any surgeries, and like for guys who are on the roster, they have to disclose that. So, yeah, it doesn't seem like anyone minor procedures that they don't have to announce anything, but generally anything that's going to cause guys to potentially miss the start of the season or whatever, like they put out a press release at some point, and we're now so far into the off season that it would be pretty shocking if someone had a surgery now. Like those all
because that's something you do in May.
Yeah, exactly.
Because all of those like Marchand surgery, Grzelcyk's surgery, those all happened in, I believe it was May last year. As soon as the offseason came, they wanted to get those done pretty much as quick as possible to start the recovery process. So seems like everybody's pretty good to go. I'm guessing that Lindholm's issue with his foot was something that could heal itself with rest and rehab. So
I want to prompt you guys with a question, and I feel like maybe we should try to dig a little deeper here, because I think the obvious answer to my question, which is, if there's one, because you talk about personnel, if there's one player to follow this year where you want to see just how that pans out and what they're capable of doing, I feel like the number one answer would be Pavel Zacha. I think he's going to be asked to play first line minutes. And Bridgette, as you've mentioned in the past, whether it's technically the second line or not, he's going to be with Pastrnak. So I think we all kind of call that the number one line. That's an easy answer, I think, for just about everybody. We all want to see how that pans out. So beyond Pavel Zacha, is there a player that you're really just very fascinated to see how they perform this year?
Bridgette, you want to go first?
Sure.
I have a couple, so I can.
I'm going to say first one pops into my head is Charlie Coyle, because he's also in an elevated role. And whereas we've seen Zacha kind of has a similar skill set to a little bit of Bergeron and a little bit of Krejci, Coyle has a completely different style of playing center than those two guys do. And he hasn't been in that role. And so he's going to be someone that he's mature, and I think he can step up, and we saw him step up in the playoffs, but he's somebody that I'm really interested to see the chemistry, and whoever he ends up between will mostly be forming new chemistry. So he's older now. He's in his early 30s, and he'll have to become a leader. I'm pretty sure, like I mentioned before, Frederick follows him as a leader. I think some of the younger guys tend to follow along behind him because he's very, he's a likable guy, seems to be pretty smart. So he's going to have to fill some of the leadership void, I think.
Yeah, I already mentioned him, but for me, it's Brad Marchand, who we think is probably going to be the captain. And on the ice, what kind of season does he have? Because last year was a good season for him, no doubt about it, but it wasn't prime Brad Marchand. It wasn't 90 to 100 point pace. Can he get back to that level? We think he's going to be healthier now that he has a full offseason, a full regular offseason. He can do all his usual training, not be recovering from hip surgery. So does that get him back to something approaching prime Brad Marchand? Can he still get there at 30, 35 years old? Or, do you settle for a really good Brad Marchand, but not quite that, top 5 to 10 forward in the NHL level? You look at this offense and it's like, boy, it sure would be a huge help if that prime Marchand, who's, top 5 to 8 in MVP voting, is still in there. But that's also a lot to ask of someone who's 35 years old. So I'm really fascinated to see what his season's going to look like. I don't expect him to like seriously decline or anything like that, but it's to me, it's like the difference between him being at an elite level and him just being at like really good level. So that's where my mind goes.
I'll stick up front as well. I mean, I have a mind to say Charlie McAvoy just because I feel like he battled last year just trying to. I mean, he still had a phenomenal season across the board, but as far as like getting back up to speed for himself and his own personal standards that he sets for himself, I just feel like he may not. He just wasn't able to have the. I don't know. I mean, the entire ceiling that he could reach last year, just because for his own standards, because he had to battle back from injury and get up to speed. But so I want to see how McAvoy bounces back if he can, find his way back into like, top 5 in Norris voting, as opposed to what was he outside the top 15 maybe, or top 12 in Norris voting last year, which made sense, right? Because he didn't have a full season under his belt, and it's just, I just feel like next year he should get back into that top 3, top 5 Norris votes. But I think up front for me, I want to see how Morgan Geekie does, and if he ends up becoming a really solid middle 6 forward for them, because I think if the Bruins want to have an offense by committee this season, with the lack of high-end depth that they've lost this past offseason, I think you're going to need him to emerge as a true bona fide number 3 centerman, who can potentially even be a second-line player at some point in his career. Because if he kind of flops, the Bruins just go from having they might not have the bottom 6 scoring, and it's unfair to put it on him, but he does seem like a player that the Bruins third line production may ride or die with, if he's a player that has a higher ceiling that he hasn't reached yet, or if he has a miss identification, I suppose, by Don Sweeney. I actually am optimistic that he's going to be a pretty good player for them, but until we see it, I don't know. So I'm curious to see how that plays out.
Yeah, a couple others that came to mind for me. One we covered pretty extensively last episode, but Trent Frederick, can he drive a line? Can he run with third line center spot? And then 2 that I want to see, like, can they stay at or close to the level they were at last year? David Pastrnak, is he going to once again be, an elite scorer in the Rocket Richard conversation, up there with anyone not named Connor McDavid in terms of production? Like, I think he can do that, but, let's see it for a second year in a row. And another one, Brandon Carlo, who last year had a really strong season after a couple inconsistent ones. And, that second pairing with him and Lindholm was an elite shutdown pairing last year. If Carlo can play at that level again, it should be once again this season. So interested to see, like, is that Carlo now here to stay and, put up that kind of really strong defensive season year after year? Or, with maybe not as great of a team around him on the ice every time out, does some inconsistency start to creep in again?
It's funny because we all picked different people. And I was thinking, when Brian started talking about, thinking about a defenseman that falls in the category of this question, I thought of Hampus Lindholm first. Because if you guys recall, Hampus Lindholm, when McAvoy was out, was just started off the season so strong. And his offensive production was great. His skating was great. He looked like a really great player for the Bruins, especially in that early part of the season. And then he started to trail off a little bit. And we mentioned in the playoffs, he wasn't looking like himself. So for him having a more consistent season where he could look like that player that he looked like early in the 2022-23 season could be huge for the Bruins, because you're talking about a fall off in offensive weapons. Well, I feel like Hampus Lindholm could be a bigger offensive weapon for them than he was towards the end of the season last year. He has the skill set and he has a skating ability and he's got good vision. So if he steps up and plays the way we know he can, he's somebody that could contribute for them offensively.
Yeah, and Lindholm was a guy who, once again, and we found out that of the injuries last year that came out, he was battling a broken foot, but he was somebody who he just was a shell of himself in the playoffs for one reason or another. And you could just tell because his skating is his strongest suit, his ability to gain separation, especially around in the net. And at times last postseason, he was just falling over himself without people on him. And so, but
that's not the kind of player he is. So you have to expect that he's going to come out looking better now that he's healed, looking more like he did last season in the early parts of the season.
Right. And the good news is he may have had a poor postseason, but he had an unbelievable regular season. And we talk about Norris votes. He had more Norris votes than Charlie McAvoy. So, and you can't get to the postseason without a strong regular season. So yes, Bridgette, I think Lindholm is a guy that, again, it's one of the reasons why you look at the Bruins forward depth on paper and you sit there and you say to yourself, there's a couple of key holes. Could those holes become smaller if certain players end up surpassing certain expectations? Sure. But I haven't looked at this Bruins team and thought to myself, well, there's no Bergeron, there's no Krejci, so there's no chance that they make the playoffs, because they did it without Krejci the year before. And so it's really, or, even extend that to Taylor Hall, Tyler Bertuzzi, like, yes, they lost a lot, but I've seen lesser forward teams make the playoffs before. But the most important thing to me is, like, you look at these teams around the league. Yeah, some team, first of all, nobody has a David Pastrnak. There's only a couple of teams that can say they have a player that's of Pasternak's caliber or better up front. So let's not forget that he's on your team, right? And Brad Marchand, right? We want to see how he plays without Bergeron, like Scott talked about him being older. But the Bruins have a couple of key guys. They might not have the depth that other teams do offensively, but I guarantee you most of those teams, they just don't have. You don't have a Charlie McAvoy, Hampus Lindholm 1-2 punch where they're on the ice 2/3 of the game, one way or the other. You don't have the Jennings, the Jennings trophy winning goaltending tandem that the Bruins have. So again, like, this team needs to stay healthy all over the ice to make the playoffs, but they have the goaltending and the defense that literally nobody else in the league really can boast. And so they don't have to have a high octane offense. They just need to have a good offense and get to the playoffs and see what happens. But there's a long ways till then. But it is interesting because I just feel like we haven't talked about the defense much in the goaltending because we haven't had to, because we know what they have and we focus on the offense. But man, I'll tell you, like, if other teams could have what the Bruins have on the back end and in the net, I mean, they'd be calling for a Stanley Cup. It's just that we've gotten used to it, and we know how much loss they had up front. But it's this Bruins team is definitely good enough to compete.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, look at the Islanders making the playoffs pretty much every year, and it's like, how do they do it? Well, they have really good goaltending. They play really good defense. But by the way, like, with a D core that doesn't have a Charlie McAvoy or arguably even a Hampus Lindholm, and with a forward group that doesn't have a David Pastrnak or even a Brad Marchand. So again, yeah, to your point, it's like there's still enough high-end talent there and a foundation of defense and goaltending that in my mind, you should be a playoff team. I'm not expecting them to win the President's Trophy or be one of the top seeds, but I think they should be in the field for sure.
And also a Jack Adams winning coach. I mean, we haven't really talked about that much. And obviously, those are all awards that they don't mean as much as the Stanley Cup. So obviously, going out in the first round of the playoffs doesn't necessarily show that you're the best coach of all time. But clearly, he was doing something right during the regular season. And going into his second year, it'll be interesting to see the dynamic that they have with him, because he seemed to always be the nice guy because they were always winning. So what kind of a coach is he when they're not winning as much? Where does he have to step in and do things differently than he did last year? Because inevitably it's not the same team, and he's going to have to change up the way he does things a little bit. And he's going to have to pull strings and put lines together and, make some tough decisions potentially along the way, tougher than what he had to do last year.
The coaching is definitely something we haven't talked about. That is for sure. That's another area where we can talk about their deficiencies in the postseason, lack of adjustments or personnel decisions that we feel like they could have made or whatnot. But I mean, yeah, Jim Montgomery is, if nothing else, right, he has shown that he can get the best out of guys, certainly in the regular season. And as I mentioned earlier, we can't look to next April because we have to focus on, I say we like we're on the team, but the Bruins can't focus on next April. They have to focus on September and then October and November in that order and not look too far ahead. But Jim Montgomery has shown that he can optimize a roster. And so can Jim Montgomery can he get Milan Lucic to put up 20 points? I don't know. He put up 17 last year under Daryl Sutter. Can he get Jesper Boquist and Morgan Geekie to reach their ceilings? I mean, he did it with Trent Frederick last year, and you can sit there and say it was
Pavel
Taylor
Zacha
Hall
as well. Pavel Zacha is somebody that he put in the right situation to succeed last year.
Yeah, and like with Trent Frederick, you can say he was with Taylor Hall. With Pavel Zacha, you can say he was with David Pastrnak, and those guys lead to production for those guys. But yeah, I mean, Montgomery instilled trust in those guys, and he got the best out of them. So he's gonna have to do that again this year. And yeah, I mean, we go into this season ultimately, like, again, we know what this team was on paper as recent as 3 months ago. So we get the loss, but we haven't really just taken a minute to recognize what they are going into the season with. And what they're going into the season with is a top 5 D core. It's a top 2, probably 3, but maybe probably top goaltending tandem. And a very, very capable and established coaching staff, especially in the regular season. So,
and capable
and have the forwards. What's that?
And capable management. That, I mean, even Swayman mentioned today how even though negotiations and everything were something he didn't want to go through, that he still thinks that they have really capable management that wants to do what's best for the team. And talking about Don Sweeney, I assume, though there's other people involved in making moves and trying to put the best team together that they can with the restraints that they have. It's not like it's not like the Red Sox, right? I hate to bring the Red Sox into this, but it's not like at the trade deadline you just go, it's good enough. Like he's not Heim Bloom. He's gonna be working his butt off to try to find ways to make the team better if they're in that position. Come trade deadline, that it seems like, okay, well, there might just be this player short. They're going to do it. He's a smart GM. They trust him after last season, even though some of the business side of things they're not happy, or Swayman wasn't happy with. He said there wasn't any ill will, and I think he still trusted on Sweeney to do the right thing to help the team. So I feel like they, as a group, from management to coaching to players, all do kind of feel like they're working together and have the same goal, like unlike the Red Sox. Unfortunately, I feel like they don't. But that we are in baseball season, so that's why I'm going to end up there. But
by the way, random housekeeping note on the coaching staff: the Bruins still need a D coach. John Gruden left to become head coach of the Toronto Marlies in the AHL, and I'm sure they have someone in mind, and probably working towards finalizing it, but that has gone on longer than I was anticipating. They haven't announced anything yet.
And you liked what he brought to the table last year, Scott, right? Activating the defense more, certainly in the power play.
Yeah, I think he was a big part of getting the defense more involved offensively. I think, the power play was him and Montgomery working together, and obviously there were stretches where the power play was great, and then there was that long drought late in the regular season where, you know, you kind of wonder if they could have done more to try to jumpstart that a little bit earlier. But yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, you know, John Gruden was definitely an asset for them last year. So, you know, my guess is Montgomery probably wants someone who has, you know, a similar approach in terms of wanting defensemen to be active. I think that's just in Montgomery's style. Go back to anywhere he's been as a coach. But yeah, obviously, whatever they have in mind, it has not been finalized yet.
And I think they like Adam McQuaid where he is, but we when you did speak to Mason Lara, he talked about how good a job that Adam McQuaid did helping him in his development. So that's someone who might be able to kind of work with the younger players, because obviously Adam McQuaid, not that far removed from playing in the NHL, and obviously a really great defenseman for the Bruins. I don't know if maybe he'd be considered, or if they really like him in that role, or maybe he doesn't even want to leave that role with player development. So who knows?
Yeah, he was the first name I thought of when Gruden left, but to your point, I think they do really like him where he is in player development. I think he's been really good in that role, and I think McQuaid really likes that role. I think he likes being like hands-on with prospects and, you know, getting out to their colleges or junior teams.
Yeah, I see him often at Hockey East games. So
yeah, so I don't know. I imagine they're both pretty happy with where that is, but I guess it could still be an option for sure. Like, I'm, you know, if we're thinking about that possibility, like, I'm sure obviously they did.
All right, so for Bruins fans listening, what is something that they could be looking forward to here in the next 3, 4, 5 weeks here? I mean, obviously, like I said, training camp isn't too far away. Are there any other times where the Bruins are going to be hitting the ice at some point this summer, gearing up for training camp?
No, really not until rookie camp, which is like the week before training camp. That's out in Buffalo, and they do like a few practices, and then there's the kind of like 3 or 4 team tournament where they'll play a few
like
games.
The Prospects Challenge or something like that. Something challenge.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, that's kind of it though. Like, really nothing until September. Obviously, all their internal contract situations are now settled. So, you know, I guess we're still waiting for some sort of announcement from Krejci. If he even makes an announcement, I could see Krejci just like disappearing and not telling anyone what he's doing, or, you know, at least not saying publicly. Obviously, I think he's told the Bruins what he's doing, but at least publicly, like, I don't think he wants to do like a press conference like Bergeron did. I don't think he needs the Bruins social media team to do a whole week of like devoted posts to him. I kind of think Krejci would be happy to just sort of fade away into the South Carolina sunset and, you know, not be in the spotlight.
Well, let me ask you though. No, go ahead, Bridgette.
He's not one for the spotlight. He's shy. He's very one of the more shy people we talk to.
He's definitely not. But I mean, look, this is a topic we haven't talked about, and I guess I'll get you guys' 2 cents on it. We all are on the same page. Krejci, to your point, we're like 99.9% sure he's done. If he weren't done and he were to come back, I mean, I still think Pavel Zacha is probably gonna maybe be looked at as like the top center on a scoring line, right? I mean, would it bump Coyle down to would Krejci be a third line? Like, what would you even do in that situation? Like, it's weird because at this stage in his career, like, I don't think he's an upgrade over Zacha. He's an upgrade over Coyle from an offensive standpoint, but Coyle's probably better defense. I mean, that would be a post Bergeron existence, but still having Krejci is something my brain's not capable of comprehending right now at this stage in Krejci's career. So I don't even know where you'd want to fit him in if you were to come back. I guess until that door closes, we should at least entertain what the Bruins would look like. I mean, we talk about they're clearly a number 1 center shy, at least as we speak right now. We don't know what Zacha becomes, but I mean,
I think Zacha becomes Bergeron and Krejci stays exactly where he was, like with Pastrnak.
Krejci stays with Pasternak, you would think?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And I think you can convince yourself that Zacha's a close enough player to Bergeron that line makes sense, like with him centering Marchand and DeBrusk.
Yeah, I can see that. I think that probably is the lineup that would make the most sense is Marchand, Zacha, DeBrusk, Van Riemsdyk, Krejci, Pasternak.
It's not a lot of speed for Pasternak to play with.
I was going to say
That's
maybe
true.
a faster left wing on that line somehow.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, or would you go Marchand, Krejci, DeBrusk? I don't know. I do think if Krejci's back, he wants to be playing with Pasternak. So, yeah, you could do that. And I think, based on like the comments Krejci made to that Czech newspaper and just some things I've heard, like it does sound like he's open, like maybe not totally slamming the door shut right now and like could be open to playing later in the season or something. But I think that's more with an eye towards, as we've said before, the World Championships in Prague next spring. I think the World Championships is something that means more in Europe than it does here because we're consumed by the Stanley Cup playoffs at the time in the spring. I think it would mean something to Krejci to play in that in his home country. But that means he's not coming back to the Bruins then because the playoffs are going on. So if he comes back to the Bruins and they're a playoff team, which we think they would be, you can't do both. You can't play in the Stanley Cup playoffs and play in the World Championship in Prague unless you're planning on an early exit, right? Because some guys go after losing in the first round, but like, what kind of plan is that? That's not a plan. You got to pick one of the others. So I think if Krejci plays at all, it would be with an eye towards the World Championships and not towards the Stanley Cup, which means.
By the way, guys, you forgot the option of the Czech line staying together. I waste a perfectly good center probably, but we're thinking you weren't going to have Krejci anyway. So you could keep the Czech line together, throw Coyle in between Marchand and DeBrusk. That's an option. I mean, it's not the best option probably, but it's an option if he's back.
It gets JVR down to the third line, which is what we said would be the ideal spot for him. So
I don't see, that could be an option, but we're thinking it's not going to happen. But
no.
Well, I only bring it up because I mean we might as well entertain it while it's still technically an option. I mean they haven't closed the door, so like I said, it doesn't hurt to bring it up for a second. But yeah, we all understand that's not likely. Okay. Any final Bruins takes, thoughts, league news takes before we get out of here?
Well, I guess we should just quickly mention there was a pretty huge trade in the Eastern Conference, which was the Penguins getting Erik Karlsson from the Sharks in a 3-team deal. And for the sake of time, I won't read through the I believe it's 12 pieces that were on the move between the three teams. But obviously the biggest part is the Penguins getting Erik Karlsson, which is fascinating because they're obviously a team that, they're trying to make their one or two final runs while they have Crosby and Malkin. And Karlsson is a huge addition. Like he had 100 points last year, won the Norris Trophy. We know, he was never a shutdown defenseman. I think in his prime, his defense was better than some people, Jack Edwards, gave him credit for. But now, like his defense actually has slipped. Like it's not good. He is all offense all the time, and he is great offensively. But I'm fascinated to see how that fits and what that does for the Penguins because I think they got better for sure. I think he makes them better, but does he make them a cup contender? Let's remember they had a lot of ground to make up. They missed the playoffs last year, so.
And they really should not have. They should not have. And we maybe would have been covering the Bruins into June if they had drawn the Penguins instead of the Panthers. Didn't they lose 2 games at the end of the season that they needed to win to like Columbus and Chicago?
Yeah,
it was lost brutal. 2 of the worst teams in the league to fall out of the playoffs.
Yeah, never forget, Bridgette. You and I were on that same boat. We both said we wanted Pittsburgh, and Scott said he wanted Florida.
Yeah, Scott, what the hell do you know?
No, I wanted Florida compared to the Islanders. The Islanders were the team I didn't want because I didn't want Sorokin.
Right. Oh, I apologize. That's true.
We all wanted Pittsburgh first.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, fair enough. I knew you wanted Florida with somebody. Yeah, Pittsburgh. I mean, that's a funny thing about the NHL. It's like the Bruins get Pittsburgh. I mean, I know it's easier said than done. I mean, they lost to the Panthers, but I really do think the Bruins beat them in 5. I mean, 5 games, and then you play. I don't even know what the bracket would shake out at that point, but regardless, but they got Florida instead.
I think they would have got.
Would it still have been Toronto?
I think so.
You probably beat Toronto probably 6 games too, probably 7 in Boston. But anyway, it didn't work out that way. So Carlson to Pittsburgh. That's interesting. It's definitely they're
back
trying
in
to
the Eastern Conference.
They're trying to optimize that window for their players. It's almost like Pittsburgh seems to be where the Bruins may have been going into last year. I mean, I don't know how many years Crosby and Malkin have left, so we'll see.
Letang too.
Letang as well. That's interesting. I mean, I've always felt Chris Letang was an unbelievable PP1 quarterback. I almost wonder, do you not rock the boat too much? And I mean, Crosby has so much chemistry with him. Do you even put Carlson on that first power play instead of Letang? I mean, you're tempted to. I mean, he's in a league of his own, really, when it comes to providing offense from the back end, especially on the power play. But there's a chemistry factor too. I'm sure they'll play around with it and see what it looks like. That's kind of, how do you not? But if Letang's on PP2, that's a pretty insane quarterback on the second unit.
Yeah.
They got better. We talked about a lot of teams that got worse and had cap strap issues, but Pittsburgh got better.
Yeah, and then I guess the other piece of league news is Bruins public enemy number 1, Tom Wilson, got honestly just an insane extension. 7 years, $6.5 million a year. I am just absolutely flabbergasted at the Capitals for giving out that contract, because beyond, like, obviously Bruins fans have one view of Tom Wilson, which is like a goon who tries to injure people. Beyond that, like, Tom Wilson is a good player. Like, I'm absolutely not saying he's not good. Like, he brings real value on the ice aside from just potentially knocking someone out. But a $6.5 million player into his mid-30s is crazy to me. Like, that, you're paying him like he's one of your 3 or 4 best forwards, and I just, especially like going into the post Ovechkin era at some point, like, I just don't see him as that kind of player. I don't see him being one of their offensive leaders for 7-8 more years, because the contract doesn't even kick in until next year. So that one blew me away when I saw the years and term on that.
Yeah,
from a health perspective too.
Yeah, like how is he going to hold up the way he plays too?
Yeah, you can dish it, but that usually makes you a bigger target as well on the other end of things. So that's just the kind of style that he plays. And I was pretty shocked with the length more than anything else. That's too long to give.
I mean, how many games did he even play last year due to injury? I mean, he only played for 25, 30 games last year.
Yeah, he missed a lot of time last year.
So that's just, I mean, look, it seems to me like they're paying him to be their next captain is what it sounds like. That's kind of what it seems to be.
He played 33 games.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so that's, I mean.
Yeah, and I guess, try to
set the tone. Because he's my age, but.
Yeah, and I guess you want him to try to, set the tone, set the culture for sort of the next era. But, man, I just cannot imagine him being worth that money. Like, I don't know. I mean, his average season is like 40 to 45 points. That's not a $6.5 million player that you give 7 years to.
His best season was 52 points in the 21-22 season. But that's, he played a lot more that season. Not the full season, but. And then other than that, mostly every season he's been below 40. And also missed quite a bit of time in those other seasons.
Yeah, they're paying for more than just offense with that deal. They're paying him to be a leader, I think, going forward, because it's not for offensive production.
Isn't that funny that him and Brad Marchand, they could both be captains at the same time of their respective teams? With those two not being looked at as the most mature people for their whole career, but now they're in the point where they might both be captains at the same time.
I feel like by the time Ovechkin retires, so that Wilson's captain, I don't think Marchand would still be in Boston for one reason or another.
I mean, Ovechkin could play until he's 50 and like literally just stand in the left circle and rip one-timers. Like,
yeah,
that's what he's gonna do.
Yeah,
it's what he's gonna do.
I went to a Bruins Capitals preseason game years ago, and he played like 5 minutes straight and just only stood there. And I don't even know if he went to the other end of the ice. He was just like was there. Didn't ever come off the ice.
It's working for him, so he's probably going to keep doing it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any final thoughts, guys?
No, I'm good.
Same.
Bridgette, you're good?
I'm good.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for listening. We will talk to you very soon. Hey, guys. Thanks for watching the Skate Podcast. If you want to see more of our videos, visit our playlist.
Not in front of a screen? You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on social media. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment.